This video is going to overview the diversity of plant life on Earth. Now, with more than 300,000 species and with just an incredible importance ecologically, being a foundation for most terrestrial ecosystems, there is so much that I could say. But this is going to be an overview. And as I go through these individual videos, obviously each video might go into details not mentioned in the overview, so feel free to consult these. The individual plant groups considering this diversity include groups which aren't always familiar to most people. And so this overview is going to begin with kind of the history of plants, because this ties in a lot of groups that people aren't as familiar with before getting to the flowering plants, which people probably know the best. So first of all, plants form a group. All plants are more closely related to each other than they are to anything else. And when we consider the rest of life on Earth, plants are related to green algae. So if we consider a family tree of plants, jumping to the end here, flowering plants, that will be the last group which we get to. This represents virtually all of the plants on Earth today. But also, if you look here, they were also the last group of plants to evolve, first appearing in the middle of the age of dinosaurs. Prior to the Jurassic period, there were 0 flowering plants on Earth. When the dinosaurs were around, it was the gymnosperms which appear earlier. These were the dominant trees and plants on Earth. But then there are these other groups as well. Now, they are less abundant today than, say, the flowering plants, but they arose earlier and help illustrate this fascinating picture of how plant anatomy developed in stages over time. And so that's how we will begin. First off, among all of the organisms on Earth which aren't plants, green algae have a lot in common with land plants. They're green. They have chloroplasts, which perform photosynthesis, releasing oxygen as a waste. And so in the group of protists, then there are, there are groups which have little to do with plants, but the green algae, they actually do share features. And so unlike brown algae, which are not related to land plants at all, despite the fact that they can be pretty big, kelps can be enormous, it is the green algae which are most closely related to land plants. Now, among the green algae, there are different kinds of green algae. And this group, the chlorophyta, they are less closely related to land plants than this second group, the charophyta. And so not only are green algae more closely related to land plants than red algae, which are more closely related than, say, brown algae, that there are different kinds of green algae which then have differing degrees of relationship. Obviously, we associate green algae with water, but green algae can live on land. So for example, here's a rock. Now notice these are land plants, which we'll get to. But see the green sheen on the rock? That's algae. So green algae can live on land. If you have something in your garden in an area that's damp, look at how green it is. So green algae can live on land. And it is from the green algae that lived on land that we get the first land plants. Now, when plants came on land, there was a couple of things that the first land plants evolved that the algae didn't have. So land plants evolved in stages. So the chlorophylls, first appear earlier in the family tree, etc. But if you ask, what makes plants? What did the algae have to evolve to become the first land plants, there are a couple of things. First, they needed a waxy covering over their surface, which would help retard water loss. So notice here, this is a plant leaf, but see the red here? That's not a cellular layer, that's a waxy coating known as a cuticle, which prevents water loss. So land plants have a cuticle that algae don't. And then if you notice, see here is a cross-section of a liverwort, which is a very primitive land plant. But see here, there is a hole, an opening known as a stoma for gas exchange. So all plants have this. They have openings, say, in the leaves of flowering plants, where oxygen, the waste, can leave, and carbon dioxide, the needed gas, can come in. And so openings for gas exchange was something that the plants have that the algae don't have. When sexual reproduction is occurring to produce what's called a diploid stage, the stage of the life cycle where there's 2 copies of each chromosome. In algae, green algae, that's typically just a single cell. So the diploid stage is just a single cell. But as you can see here and here, the diploid phase is bigger and is made of multiple cells. The areas which are developing the sex cells, the sperm and the ova, and yes, plants do produce sperm and ova, they are multicellular. They're called gametangia. So there's multicellular structures here. Even the simplest plants have differentiated tissues. So all of the cells then can specialize in a way that we don't see in algae, where typically one cell is essentially the same as the next. And so, in other words, these are features which evolved in the algae which were adapting to life on land, and thus all land plants share features. So land plants are a group descended from a common ancestor in the family tree that evolved these features which were absent in the algae which then preceded them. The fossil record suggests occurred by the Cambrian period, say 500 million years ago. The earliest plants in the fossil record seem to be similar to the most primitive plants alive today. So here is a liverwort, the most primitive plant alive today. Here are liverworts, and you see them growing near water. A couple of things leap out at us as far as being primitive. First, obviously, they don't have flowers. They don't have seeds. They don't have true leaves or roots. And another thing that leaps out is they can't grow to be tall. So these are rather short plants. That's why they need to grow near water, because they don't have what's called vascular tissue, which will transport water from the ground, where like a root might take water up to a higher part of the plant. And so therefore, these are very low to the ground and often growing in moisture environments. Another reason that they need water is because these are primitive plants and they actually have swimming sperm. So instead of having sperm develop inside a pollen tube, the way, say, flowering plants do or pine trees, they actually have swimming sperm that have to swim to find the ova that reproductive structures are producing. So they rely on water. Now, liverworts are the most primitive plants, but mosses are like them in that mosses can't grow to be very tall, and also because they lack vascular tissue, and that they often need to develop in moist environments. One, because they can't grow to be tall, they don't have vascular tissue which can conduct water from the, say, root-like structures in the ground up to the leaves. So here are mosses. Once again, they can't grow to be very tall. And mosses, like liverworts, also have swimming sperm. And so these are primitive plants which are still dependent on water. Now, once again, this is something that strikes us as odd because most plants alive today are vascular. They have tissue, vascular tissue, which allows them to transport water up a stem. So for example, most of the trunk of the tree is vascular tissue. Most of it's transporting water up. Some of it can transport sugar in either direction. So ferns are vascular plants, pine trees are vascular plants, flowering plants are vascular plants, but mosses and liverworts are not. So if you were to look in the green leafy part of a moss, it's not a true leaf because it doesn't have specialized tissue. There's no veins which allow it to transport water. There's no vascular tissue. And so mosses are non-vascular plants. That's why they can't grow to be tall. Now, before I go on, moss is obviously very important. One of the things that they often serve as is in primary succession. When you start off with bare rock, very often it's things like mosses and liverworts in an aquatic environment, or lichens, which colonize the bare rock. And once they start to lay down a little bit of soil, then other plants can then begin to take hold. So that's very useful in mosses. In any case, mosses and liverworts, because they lack vascular tissue, are the most primitive plants alive today. And we also, from the fossil record, it seems that they came first. All right, and so when plants first appear, they don't grow to be tall. They don't have vascular tissue. They don't have leaves, seeds, or flowers. So it was non-vascular plants which come first. And then so if you look at the Cambrian period, the Ordovician period, then into the Silurian period, the plants on Earth, they were non-vascular. They would have grown only to be very short. But then something happened by the end of the Silurian period. In addition to these earlier primitive plants which lacked vascular tissue, there were then the very first vascular plants which could now grow to be taller. Now they weren't that tall at first, but nevertheless, this was a very important development. They don't have leaves, or true roots yet. That would come later. But once again, there were vascular plants on Earth for the first time by the end of the Silurian period, with Cooksonia here being one of the primitive members here. So here you see a primitive vascular plant. Now, today we still have some primitive vascular plants which are alive, which remind us of those. Oh, I'm sorry, before I do that. So just speaking of vascular tissue, in the previous movie, mosses did not have vascular tissue in the part that does photosynthesis, so we couldn't really call it a true leaf. But if you were to now look at the fern under the microscope, you'll note that there is a vein. There is true vascular tissue where you have cells where their job is to transport water. Very often they die. So you have dead cells and they're hollow that transport water. And then you can have cells which transport sugar. And so ferns, like, here's a tree fern. So ferns can grow to be tall. Tree ferns can be 20 feet tall. Lycopods, pine trees, and flowering plants are all vascular plants because they have vascular tissue. So that was after land plants adapted to land with the cuticle, with the tissues, etc. Then the next big step in plant evolution was to get vascular tissue, which allowed plants to get to be tall. Now, after that, there were leaves would come later, but this plant, it really doesn't have leaves. Notice it's growing to be tall, and that's good, but it doesn't really have leaves. See, this plant, it's not really, it doesn't really have leaves. It's growing to be tall, this horsetail. But these are examples of primitive vascular plants. So they grow to be tall, they have vascular tissue, but they don't yet have true leaves. So there are a number of these primitive plants today where essentially the stems are green. The photosynthesis is occurring in the stem. Now this is an advantage over the moss because, see, the moss has to live in their shadow. They get the sunlight first. So having vascular tissue is an advantage over having no vascular tissue. So this is a more advanced plant. But then the advance after this would be to develop leaves. There are two different kinds of leaves. One type of plant called a lycopod has little leaves, microphyls if you want. So here's a lycopod. They have little leaves. Here are lycopods. They have little leaves. So these leaves are an advantage over the condition of not having leaves. Now, lycopods do exist today, so these club mosses are alive today. But lycopods, they were more significant in the fossil record, because when you look at the early plants which had leaves, they were lycopods and ferns. The pine trees and the flowering plants, they would come much later. And that some of these helped to compose the earliest trees and the earliest forests. So when trees first evolved on planet Earth, there were no pine trees, and there were certainly no oaks, maples, and other flowering plants. The tallest trees were these lycopods, and then there were also tree ferns, which I'll get to. So the first forests were very different from the forests of today. Tree ferns and lycopods were the dominant trees here. And it was these ancient forests which formed coal. And so it was in the Carboniferous period, the period in Earth's history named after all of the carbon reserves in coal, when there were, these vast coal swamp forests, lycopods and tree ferns. When these trees died and fell in the stagnant water, then they wouldn't decompose fully, and then a lot of their remains would then end up being compacted and forming, these layers of carbon one after another, which then give us coal. And so when we look at the plant diversity which we see today, the most primitive plants are then also the descendants of the oldest groups. And so if we wanted to kind of get an idea of plant history, green algae are ancient. They go back over 1 billion years, but around 500 million years ago in the Cambrian, then plants made it onto land, but they were simple plants like the mosses and liverworts alive today. A little bit later, by the end of the Silurian period, there were primitive vascular plants which could now grow to be tall because they could conduct water from the ground up a height. That was a big advance that came after tens of millions of years. And so the horsetails and then things like this whisk fern, Psilotum, these have green stems, but they don't have leaves. And so these are remnants of plants which had vascular tissue, but didn't go any further. Then after that, there was a new development in which plants had leaves. And so the leaves came later, and then would include plants like ferns and lycopods. So they have true leaves and true roots, which have vascular tissue in them. So they come a little bit later. And with these developments, then both the lycopods and the ferns, they can develop into trees. So this was the next big advance in plant history. There are true leaves and roots. And so everything above this point has true leaves and roots. These things don't have seeds, however. So seeds would be the next development that we're going to talk about. But first, I'd like to just kind of compare and contrast. Before talking about plant reproduction, let's just talk about animal reproduction for a reference. When we look at how animals reproduce, this cat is obviously putting an incredible amount of effort into helping the next generation. And so this cat had a very small number of offspring, but the fetus is actually developed in the female's body. And here is the female cat nourishing the infant after birth. So there is a small number of offspring, but each one receives an enormous amount of resources to help it get established in life. If you look instead at these frogs, all right, these are frog eggs, there's far more, all right? They don't have as much nourishment as that cat had. And so the frog female, her strategy was a little different. Rather than put that much emphasis and that much, nutrition into any one infant, there were far more. And the advantage is, while each of those tadpoles is less likely to survive, they have less nutrients, just because of the sheer number, then, some tadpoles are bound to make it, to be adult frogs. Same thing here. This is a lamprey female being dissected. And notice that each of these dots is an egg. She can produce hundreds of thousands of eggs at a time. Now, because these eggs are small, she's obviously not putting much resources into any one egg. So any one of these doesn't have a really high chance of surviving. But because she's making so many, some of them are bound to survive. So here you see two different strategies in animals. Have, a great number of offspring, but not, put too much into the care of any one of them. Now, that might mean that they're less likely to survive, but the number of them means that, the odds are that, some of them will reach the next generation, versus having a much smaller number, but investing far more into their care. So that's, variations in animal reproduction. But then we could see the same thing in plants, all right? So if we were to look at plants, the seed is a plant embryo with food to help it get nourished and get, established in life. So here's maple seeds. They're big. You can see them with the naked eye. They have these structures to help them, transport. Here is a, oh, I just missed it. Here you see a seed of a pine tree and a pine cone. Notice that it's big. It's not only got an embryo, but food to help the embryo get established. Here's a walnut. Now, that's not just a microscopic embryo. It's a lot of food to help it get established. Here's a coconut, even more. All right, so seeds then are embryos that have a lot of potential nourishment to help them get established. That's different from a spore. So when we look at how moths reproduce, they produce spores. These are not seeds. They are embryos with essentially no food, all right? And now each of them is less likely to survive than a seed because there's no food there. But because there's so many, spores are easy to make. Some of them are more likely to make it. In the same way, here on the underside of a fern, we see all of these fern spores. They really don't have much in the way of food along with them. So each individual is not that likely then to be successful. But because they're easy to make, so many of them can be made that some of them are bound to survive. And so just as animals can vary, as we look at this female frog, you can, where was here a second ago? So just as a female frog can make lots of eggs that are small with not that much nourishment, per egg compared to say a chicken, for example. But the odds are, produce a large number of potential offspring, and even if they don't all make it just by numbers, some of them are bound to. Some plants do the same thing in producing spores, produce a large number of embryos. Each one is less likely to survive, but the sheer number means that many are likely to make it. All of the earliest plants were spore producing. So mosses and liverworts produce spores. The whisk fern, the horsetails produce spores. Lycopods produce spores. Ferns produce spores, all right? Now, somewhere along the way, seeds evolved. There are actually plants which are known as seed ferns, known in the fossil record. They are extinct today. It's a little hard to talk about them simply because we'd have to get more into plant classification. And so we could argue, are they really seed ferns? Are they pro-gymnosperms, like something partway between ferns and gymnosperms? We could argue about these. So, we don't need to. And so seeds evolved late in the Paleozoic era. There were some extinct seed plants, those seed ferns, which, might be several different groups. And then there are the two groups of seed plants alive today. The pine trees and their relatives, these are the gymnosperms, and then the flowering plants which come later. So if you look at this pine cone, this is where the female structures are. The male gametes are in pollen grains. So pollen grains essentially are either, they include sperm or the cells that when they divide become sperm. And so then the male components, just as in animals, sperm fertilize ova, there are male pine cones which produce the pollen which contains sperm. There are female pine cones which have the female eggs. And then when pollen reaches then the sperm fertilize the ova. And now you not only get an embryo, but now food is packaged around it to make a seed. All right. Now, gymnosperms are called naked seeds. That's literally what the name means, because unlike the flowering plants, they lack these other seed coats of maternal tissue, which will go around it. Now, the first gymnosperms evolved in the Permian period, so before the mass extinction at the end of the Paleozoic. And then thus by the time of the Mesozoic era, when the dinosaurs were around, the gymnosperms, the pine trees and their relatives, were the dominant plants. Now today, pine trees are the major gymnosperms, but there are a couple of other groups. There are the cycads. They may look like palm trees, but they're not palms at all. They are gymnosperms. They even still have swimming sperm. So that's still a primitive feature that they retain. There is a group in Africa, Welwitschia, which is an odd plant. There are ginkgos, which are very popular for landscaping. They were once much more widespread, including in the United States. But in recent times, they were only in China. They thought it was thought that they were extinct. These look like flowering plants, but they're actually relatives of pine trees, this ginkgo. There are a couple of minor groups of gymnosperms, like ginkgos, that African plant Welwitschia, and cycads in the Caribbean. But most of the several hundred kinds of gymnosperm alive today are things like pines, spruces, firs, junipers, cedars. They are doing, they include the tallest trees in sequoias and redwoods. They include some of the oldest plants on Earth. The bristlecone pines are more, some of them are more than 4,000 years old. And as especially in mountains near the Arctic, they can be dominant plants. Their needles, help not to catch too much snow, so they won't weigh too much and break branches. But also their narrow needles help prevent water loss. And so pine needles are actually narrow leaves. So late in the Paleozoic era, one of the new advances of the plant family tree was to evolve seeds. And today we have two groups of seed plants which are alive today: the gymnosperms, which were dominant trees during the age of dinosaurs, and then the flowering plants. The fancy word for that is angiosperm. Okay. So in our plant cladogram here, depicting the diversity of plants on Earth, seeds were a late development evolving here. And then once again, there are two groups of seed plants alive today: the gymnosperms with the pine trees, and then the flowering plants known as angiosperms. Flowers evolved here, all right, in the middle of the age of dinosaurs, in the Jurassic. So flowering plants, they represent most plants alive today. Most of what is green today on Earth is a flowering plant. But they were the last group to evolve. Most of the history of plants occurred without any flowering plants at all. And it's interesting then that the traits that we see in flowering plants evolved in stages. So first, plants develop the cuticle tissues and those openings for gas exchange, and they come out onto land, and liverworts and mosses are, a branch which has survived with those features. Later, then plants evolve vascular tissue, which let them grow to be tall, and things like whisk ferns and horsetails are remnants of that branch. And then true leaves and roots evolved, and things like ferns and lycopods are derived from that branch. Later, seeds evolved, and the gymnosperms, they are remnants of that branch. And then flowers evolved in the mid-Mesozoic era, and these represent most plants alive today. Now, the flowering plants, obviously, they have various lineages. They evolved over time as well. So once flowers first appeared in the age of dinosaurs, that didn't mean that there were grasses and oaks and maples, etc. So flowers, they diversified. By the very end of the age of dinosaurs, they were becoming common as a ground cover and as low trees, but it really wouldn't be until the age of mammals in the last 65 million years that they really came into their own. So there's a number of primitive groups of flowers known in the fossil record, some of which have some, remnants alive today. Magnolias are a primitive group of flowers. Most of the flowering plants alive today are either classified as monocots. This includes orchids, rice, wheat, corn, bamboo, palms, bananas, lilies, irises, onions, daffodils, and others. And then the dicots, all right? Monocot and dicot refer to when the seeds first germinate. Do they have one seed leaf or cotyledon? That would be a monocot with one. Or do they have two seed leaves and they're dicots as two? And so the true dicots, they include oaks, maples, most of the trees, which are flowering plants like hickories, apples, et cetera, but then also tomatoes, roses, asters, mints, etc. So most of the flowering plants are either classified as monocots or dicots. Now, before wrapping up, not everyone appreciates what is meant by flower. So let me just kind of define what is a flower. Obviously, these are flowers, and the reason we have these flowers is because this plant would like to have sex with this plant, but they're on opposite sides of a swamp, and they have roots they can't move. So obviously, that's frustrating. So how could this plant have sex with that plant? But then they decide maybe animals, which can move, maybe animals could help. And so these plants have decided to make colorful modified leaves, which we call petals, especially in the color of blue. This plant is trying to attract bees, and bees, they like the color blue as opposed to red, which they don't really perceive well. And then you'll notice that there is free food for the bees, and the flower is so helping the bee because it even has these guidelines to guide it to the middle of the flower. So here, this flower is offering free food to bees. So the bee sees this, recognizes the colorful petal, recognizes the guidelines, and then goes to the interior of the flower and gets a free meal. Unbeknownst to the bee, the flower has sex organs which make female and male gametes, sperm and ova. Just as animals reproduce sexually and produce sperm and ova, so do plants. These higher plants no longer have swimming sperm that need water. Instead, the sperm develop inside a pollen tube. And so as this bee is getting its free meal, the plant is rubbing its male gametes, its pollen, over the bee's body. And so when the bee leaves the plant, it now has sperm, where the cells that when they divide become sperm, on its hairs. This bee then goes to the second flower to get more of, more free food. But in doing so, then it can drop the male gametes, the sperm and the pollen grains from flower number one onto the female parts of flower number two. So this flower could then have sex with that flower. Its sperm fertilized this one's ova, but they couldn't move, and they enlisted the help of an animal in this process. All right, so clearly that is something that a lot of plants use, and thus plants are often very, very colorful. However, there are other ways for plants to get their male gametes from one plant to the female gametes of another, which don't involve animals. And so therefore, not all flowers are brightly colored. These flowers are brightly colored because they're trying to attract an animal. Right? Bees like blue and purple and yellow, hummingbirds and butterflies like red, open flowers attract beetles and ants and flies. And so these flowers are trying to enlist the help of animals in order to reproduce. But this oak tree, these grass plants, they are also flowering plants. Now one would say that's not a flower, that's not like a rose, that's not like the lily that we just the iris that we just saw. It's not like a lily, but nevertheless these are flowers. They're not brightly colored because these plants are not trying to attract animals. They are going to use the wind. See, the wind doesn't care what color you are. It's going to blow either way. And so investing all of that energy in nice, pretty blue petals, okay, or in nectar, or in a sweet aroma, that's wasted energy. So these plants are simply going to produce a lot of pollen and let the wind blow and hope that by dumb luck, the wind blows pollen from flower number one, and hopefully flower number two is now downwind of this, and by dumb luck, some of the pollen ends up on the female parts of flowers here. Now, obviously, most of the pollen won't, so that the energy that these plants save in not giving nectar to animals and giving them free food has to go into generating extra pollen grains just because of how wasteful this process is. We know from our allergy season how much pollen there is in the air, or how much dust might be on our cars if we park under a tree that's producing this pollen. The point is that not all flowers are pretty or smell nice because many are using the wind instead. So flowering plants evolved, which have a series of concentric rings. So there is an outer layer of modified leaves, which we call sepals. So when you think of a rosebud, there's these green sepals which surround it. Sometimes these are more colorful, like for example in poinsettia, the sepals can actually be pigmented. The next layer in from that are the petals. The layer inside from that are the structures which make the pollen. That's the male structures. And then finally, the central structure is the female structure. And so a typical flower gets pollinated when pollen from a male structure ends up here, and then a pollen tube can grow and then fertilize the ovum here. Now, flowers can vary, and so that would be a whole nother lecture, the variation in flowers. But the final point is, virtually everything that's green is a flower, even though you don't necessarily think that. So grass is a flower. It's not a colorful flower, but it's a flower nonetheless. Oak trees, maple trees, hickories, walnuts, etc., they are flowering plants. They don't have obvious flowers, but nevertheless, they are flowering plants. So when we look outside, flowering plants, with their well over 200,000 species, are the most abundant plants alive today. There are more angiosperms, more flowering plants, than any other group. So this group is the most successful. But as you can see here, it was the last group to evolve. So all of the other groups, date back to prior to the Mesozoic era. The flowering plants are first known from the middle of the Mesozoic. And also now notice that the complex features of plants evolved in stages. First there were cuticles and tissues adapting to land, and then later vascular tissue. and then later later true leaves and roots, and then later seeds, and then later flowers. So the diversity of plants alive today could be introduced nicely by studying the history of plants and the order in which these adaptations arose.